What's going on, everybody? Happy Monday. Welcome back to another installment of Mr. Eric Reads. Tonight's book was actually given to me by Miss Debbie Callan over at our CSRA RISA, and I've been waiting for the right moment to read it, and this is it. I'm very excited about this because as we near the beginning of school again, there may be some feelings of, oh, does anybody want me there? Does anybody care who I am? And obviously the answer is yes. This guy, number one. But I think it's a really good book. I think you'll really enjoy it. So again, thank you, Miss Debbie, for allowing me to have this book. It's called Somebody Loves You, Mr. Hatch. And this book is by Eileen Spinelli. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Somebody Loves You, Mr. Hatch, here on Mr. Eric Reads. Wink, wink, wink. Mr. Hatch was a tall and thin man who did not smile. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, he would leave his brick house and walk 8 blocks to the shoelace factory where he worked. At lunchtime, he would sit alone in a corner, eat his cheese and mustard sandwich, and drink a cup of coffee. Sometimes he brought a prune for dessert. And then after work, he would make 2 stops, at a newspaper stand to get the paper, and at the grocery store to buy a fresh turkey wing for his supper. And after supper, he'd read the paper, he would take a shower, and goes to bed early. He keeps to himself. That's what everybody said about Mr. Hatch. One Saturday, when Mr. Hatch stepped onto his porch with his dustpan and broom, he got a surprise. It was a package wrapped in brown paper. Well, he had never spoken to the postman before. Thank you, Mr. Goober, he said. Mr. Goober smiled. You're welcome. I always enjoy delivering packages. So Mr. Hatch tore the brown paper off. Inside was a white box, which he opened to find another box. And this one was a heart-shaped box, all satiny red and with a pink bow on top. It was filled with candy. Something fluttered to the porch floor. It was a little white card. He picked it up, and it said, Somebody Loves You. Only then did he remember that this was Valentine's Day. Mr. Hatch wondered and wondered, now who of my friends would send this to me? He was all alone. He had no friends, and yet someone had sent him a valentine. But who? Who? He put the box on the coffee table and tried to do some dusting, but every time he left the room, he had to keep peeking to see if the box was still there. He dusted, and the dust cloth seemed to whisper, Somebody loves you. Somebody loves you. At last, he flung the dust cloth away and exclaimed, Why, I've got a secret admirer. And then he did something he had never done before. He laughed. He laughed and he danced and he clapped his hands. And then he took a piece of candy from the box and he ate it. Mr. Hatch changed his shirt and found some old aftershave in the bottom drawer. He splashed it on his face, and he picked out a yellow tie with blue polka dots and he put it on. And then he went for a walk. Maybe, he thought, I will meet the person who sent me the candy. Of course, no one had ever seen Mr. Hatch wearing a tie, or smelling of aftershave, or even smiling. So, needless to say, he got a lot of attention. Mrs. Weed tripped over her dog, Mr. Dunwoody nearly fell off his ladder, and little Tina Finn spilled all the toys out of her wagon. Mr. Hatch waved hello to them all. On Monday, it was back to work. At lunchtime, Mr. Hatch sat in the middle of the cafeteria. He spoke to everyone and passed out chocolates from his heart box. On the way home, as usual, he stopped at the newspaper stand. Mr. Smith handed him the usual newspaper. Mr. Hatch said. I think I'll have a pack of mints, he said, which was not as usual. Mr. Smith looked shocked. Why, is that you speaking, Mr. Hatch? Indeed it is, Mr. Hatch said. I said I would also like a pack of mints, and if I don't mind saying so, Mr. Smith, you don't look very well today. Well, Mr. Smith recovered from the shock to reply, Yeah, you're right. I don't feel very well. I have a cold, and I suppose I'd go to the doctor's this afternoon, but the stand has been so busy I hadn't had the time. So Mr. Hatch smiled. Why, I'd be happy to watch the stand for you while you go. Mr. Smith could hardly believe his ears. I mean, you would? Certainly. Just show me what to do. And so Mr. Hatch ran the newspaper stand for an hour. He wondered if any of the women who stopped by the paper or the magazine or a candy bar had sent him the mysterious valentines. When Mr. Smith returned, Mr. Hatch made his usual stop at the grocery store. I'm a little tired of turkey wings, he told Mr. Todd. I think I'll have a nice, fresh slice of ham. I am, said Mr. Todd. My little girl is late, and she hasn't come home from school yet, and I can't leave the store to go look for her. Oh, said Mr. Hatch. That's why you look worried. Yes. Well, goodness, why didn't you say so, said Mr. Hatch. I will go and look for her. And so he walked to the school and found little Melanie Todd by the swings and brought her home. Oh, thank you, said the grocer. Any time, said Mr. Hatch. After supper, Mr. Hatch did not bother to read the paper. He decided to bake brownies instead. It would be a nice treat to have brownies to share the next day with his people at the shoelace factory. As he baked, the warm chocolate smell of brownies floated through the neighborhood. Children gathered around Mr. Hatch's house, sniffing the air. Well, I suppose the factory can wait, said Mr. Hatch as he looked out the window and brought out 2 platefuls. Now, what about brownies that don't have lemonade? He said. And so with that, he stirred up a nice cold pitcher of lemonade. When the parents came to gather their children, they had some brownies too. It turned out to be a picnic in Mr. Hatch's backyard. He dusted off an old harmonica and played songs that he remembered from his childhood. And everybody danced. So the days and the weeks went by. When Mr. Hatch wasn't smiling, he was laughing. And when he wasn't laughing, he was helping someone. And when he wasn't helping someone, he was having a party in his yard or on his porch. He seemed to have forgotten about finding the person who sent him that valentine. Then one afternoon, Mr. Goober, the postman, came to the door. His face was very serious. Well, come in, Mr. Goober, said Mr. Hatch. You look upset. I am upset, he said. I made a mistake some time ago. My supervisor's very angry with me. Do you? Yes, Mr. Goober, said Mr. Hatch. What is it? Do you recall the package I delivered to you on Valentine's Day? I think it was. Why, yes, I believe so, replied Mr. Hatch, beginning to feel a little uneasy. I don't suppose you have it still, said Mr. Goober sadly. Well, as a matter of fact, I still have the box. The candy is gone, though, said Mr. Hatch. Why do you ask? The postman took a deep breath. I'm afraid I delivered it to the wrong address. It was supposed to go to another house. Mr. Hatch recalled tearing off the brown paper. It had never occurred to him to look at the address. He fetched the heart-shaped box and the pink bow and gave it to the postman. I do hope your supervisor won't be too angry with you now, said Mr. Hatch. The postman was heading down the sidewalk when Mr. Hatch called from his porch. "Mr. Goober, I forgot something." He gave the postman the little white card that read, "Somebody loves you." Alone in his living room, Mr. Hatch sighed. Nobody loved me after all. Then he read the paper, took a shower, and went to bed early. The next morning at 6:30 sharp, Mr. Hatch left the brick house, walked 8 miles to the shoelace factory. At lunchtime, he sat in the corner by himself, ate his cheese and mustard sandwich, and drank a cup of coffee. After work, he stopped at the newspaper stand for a paper, but he did not speak to Mr. Smith. And when he ordered his turkey wing for Mr. Todd, he did not smile, nor did he pat little Melanie Todd on the head or bake brownies or have picnics or parties or play his old harmonica anymore. Everyone whispered, "What is wrong with Mr. Hatch?" Mr. Goober, the postman, told them. But we love Mr. Hatch, insisted Mr. and Mrs. Dunwoody. "He gave us flowers for our garden. He helped mend the back fence." Mrs. Wee nodded. "And I love him too. He saved his bones for my dog Ruffy." Ruffy barked, because Ruffy loved Mr. Hatch too. Mr. Smith told everyone how Mr. Hatch had watched his newsstand so he could visit the doctor, and Mr. Todd told everyone how Mr. Hatch had found his little girl. All the children in the neighborhood remembered Mr. Hatch's wonderful brownies and lemonade, and most of his laughter. "Poor Mr. Hatch," they said. "What can we do?" Then Mr. Goober announced, "I think I have an idea." So on Saturday morning, Mr. Hatch woke to a bright sunny day. He put on his old overalls and went to the porch with his dustpan and broom. He couldn't believe his eyes. All over the porch were red and pink hearts with pink bows. There were boxes of candy on the chairs and yellow streamers flowing from the ceiling. And sticking up out of his mailbox was a shining silver harmonica. The front yard was filled with people, happy, smiling people, and they were holding up a huge sign with painted letters, and it said, "Everybody loves you, Mr. Hatch." Mr. Hatch dabbed a tear with his handkerchief. "I do believe," he sniffled, "somebody loves me after all." And then he smiled, and they laughed, and they hurried down to be with his friends. The end. Somebody loves you, Mr. Hatch. Again, a gift from Miss Debbie Callan over at CSRA RESA. Thank you again. Guys, the moral of the story is pretty clear. The way we treat other people, and just one little sentence can change the way somebody's whole outlook is on life and the way they view themselves and the way people view the world, and it's a beautiful thing. So that ties in exactly to what I talk about at the end of every video. Practice kindness, because you never know how you can make somebody's day. Stay safe, guys, and wash your hands, and I'll see you soon. Take care.